Welcome to GB News. Do you want to set out fairly briefly the thesis of your book?
So in my book, This Is Not America, I argue that when we think about race in the UK, we should think about it through a UK context because the Black British population is different in many relevant ways from the Black American population. So in terms of demographics, for example, Black people constitute about 13% of the American population, whereas in the UK, Black people only constitute about 4% of the UK's population. And there is far wider internal diversity within the Black British population. So in America, for example, over 90% of Black Americans are the descendants of enslaved Africans that were transported between the 17th and the 19th centuries. Whereas in the UK, the striking thing is that the overwhelming majority of Black British people are either immigrants or the children of immigrants from Africa. So up until 25 years ago, to be Black British meant mostly to be Black Caribbean. But over the past 25 years, there's been a massive influx of immigration from Africa, which has completely changed the demographic makeup of the Black British population. So there are twice as many Black African people as there are Black Caribbean people. And I think when we think about what it means to be Black and British, it's not just one singular thing. It's something which is evolving. And I think that needs to be incorporated into conversations around race in the UK.
I suppose some people might say those are jolly interesting points.
Yeah.
But if on both sides of the Atlantic, Black people are facing racism, which is holding them back and distorting their outcomes, then it is appropriate to think across countries and continents.
It's appropriate, but I think it's appropriate at a very superficial level. So if we think about something like education, for example, the experiences of Black British people in the educational system is not something that you can just assume simply on the basis of race. So there are many Black British communities that are struggling in education, but there are others that are actually thriving. So, for example, Black Caribbean pupils are more than 3 times more likely to be excluded from schools than Black African pupils. Black African pupils, in fact, are less likely to be excluded from schools than white British pupils. So when we talk about things like inequality and disadvantage, we need to be more specific in our focus rather than just looking at it through the lens of race.
So it is not your thesis that there is not racism in Britain. What do you feel about racism in Britain? Where do you think it exists?
Yeah, so I do think there is racism in Britain. There is racism in some British institutions. Some British people espouse racist views. I don't argue in my book that we live in a sort of post-racist society. I don't think so. What I do argue is when we think about racism, we need to look at it through context. And we also need to acknowledge the fact that racism is not the only thing that explains inequality and disadvantage in society. I also argue that we should not look at Black people or any other ethnic minority people through the lens of their racial background, because to do so is to replicate the same kind of racializing view that racists do.
You could have argued those topics under any title, but you've actually argued it under the title, This Is Not America.
Yes.
Implying to me that you see quite a danger in using the wrong lens to view this subject.
Yes.
So, for example, when you saw the response to Black Lives Matter, to the killing in Minneapolis, when you saw, I don't know, footballers taking the knee and so on, did you feel there were dangers here, or did you just think, oh, these people are intellectually confused?
I think it's dangerous because I think it actually obscures what's actually going on in the UK. And I think the response to the murder of George Floyd in America led to what I consider to be an extremely patronizing attitude from often well-meaning liberal, left and progressive people.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, because I felt that after that response, they simply saw Black people as victims and nothing else. And I think that kind of attitude to race and race relations is extremely patronizing because the experience of black and ethnic minority people is not simply defined through the experience of racism.
So the paradox here that well-meaning people, as you put it, were in fact being racist because they saw black people as all the same thing. Are you going that far?
I wouldn't call them racist.
No. Okay.
But I do think that that kind of attitude is dangerous precisely because it puts too much of an emphasis on race to the exclusion of all the other aspects of somebody's identity. And I also found it dangerous because I think any approach to trying to combat racism needs to be collaborative. And I felt all too often there was a kind of stigma attached to being white, essentially, a kind of, which I find completely counterproductive and completely divisive. And I think any approach to combating racism, any actually effective form of anti-racism needs to be collaborative and needs to be approached with a greater degree of good faith than what I saw in the summer of 2020.
What's the appropriate attitude for a white person like me towards Britain's colonial past? How should I deal with it?
Curiosity, and genuine curiosity, not the kind of moralizing, sort of sanctimonious attitude that I see many people approach Britain's colonial past, which just sees it as a kind of zero-sum game. It's either completely terrible or completely wonderful. And I think any genuinely curious approach to history would view it in a more nuanced and a more sophisticated way.
I ask you just very briefly, people can hear what you've argued in this book.
Yes.
Are you being cancelled? Are you getting hostility?
Well, the response has been very broadly positive, but there are some people that obviously disagree with me, but some people as well that see me as a kind of race traitor, but they are a small minority. They're a fringe, basically.
Thank you so much for coming on GB News. So the book is called This Is Not America, Why Black Lives in Britain Matter. Tom Owolade.